Shalom from Jerusalem. This is once again Watchmen Talk, and we are having our second part of a conversation with retired British Army Colonel Richard Kemp. Thank you for coming over again. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Good to be with you again.
So we stopped earlier when the British Army went into the Falkland War. What was the role of your regiment, yourself, during that conflict?
My regiment wasn't involved. It was a relatively small war. The British Army at that time, unlike today, was pretty big. It was something like 150,000 strong, which that's probably almost twice the size it is today. So it didn't involve the whole of the army. Only a small number of battalions deployed to fight. My regiment wasn't one of them, and nor was I. I didn't take part. Unfortunately, it was probably the one war that I missed during my service, which I regret eternally. But it was I think a high watermark for not just for the British Armed Forces, but also for Great Britain, because
rejoice.
Yeah. Margaret Thatcher's words, and I think one thing that is interesting is that right at the very beginning, when the Argentinians invaded the Falklands, and of course let's not forget, the Falklands is British sovereign territory. It was never part of Argentina. The Falklands had British presence in it before Argentina existed as a country. So it's not a question of us having taken it from the Argentinians, but they decided, I think, for more political problems at home, they decided to invade. And when they did, the head of the Royal Navy, Admiral Leach, went straight across to 10 Downing Street to see Margaret Thatcher. The Chief of the Defence Staff was away in Australia when it began, so the head of the Navy was basically standing in. And Margaret Thatcher said to him, should we try and retake it? And Leach said to her, and Leach is a very experienced man who actually had a ship sunk out from under him in the Second World War, so he was an experienced combat naval man. He said, if we don't retake the Falklands, then we will wake up tomorrow in a different country. In other words, Britain will be trampled all over. The sovereignty of democracies will be in question around the world. And I think he personally convinced Margaret Thatcher not only that it was the right thing to do, but that the British Armed Forces could do it.
Which, by the way, also shows you that having a military junta or junta in power, as was the case in Buenos Aires, is a very bad idea.
Yeah, I think, and there's many cases in his history where that's been borne out.
So following Falklands, you were back to Germany or back and forth, Germany and Ireland?
My personal career consisted of, as I mentioned before, a lot of time in Germany, a lot of time in Northern Ireland. And then really after, we had a period of time in the mid-90s where the British Army had a heavy commitment in the Balkans, and I did several tours in
Kosovo?
the Balkans, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Macedonia, and
under NATO.
Sometimes under the United Nations, sometimes under NATO, different places, different times. My service in Bosnia was under the United Nations
Blue Helmets
Force. Yeah, exactly. And so we did a lot of peacekeeping operations there. I also did peacekeeping operations in Cyprus, which was not exactly the most demanding operational tour I've ever been on. And then it was after. But
you have accumulated some experience in separating, in that case, Turks from Greeks earlier in Northern Ireland and. Yeah. The list can go on and on.
And indeed, after the Berlin Wall fell, that changed the pattern of the British Army of being based in a number of quite tropical places like Hong Kong and different countries around the world, Cyprus, but mainly in Germany, the UK, and Northern Ireland. The fall of the Berlin Wall changed all that, and of course, one of the first things that happened was the first Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and I was involved in that war in 1990, 1991.
Tell us about it. Recount your experience.
Yeah, please. I mean, I had an unusual experience in that war because I was, as I mentioned in the first part, I was an infantry soldier, so I was trained and experienced in fighting on my feet. But in that war, I fought in a tank, a Challenger 1 tank, which was the
7th Armored Brigade.
7th Armored Brigade.
Which is, by the way, also in the Israeli Defense Forces. the most prominent armor brigade.
yeah.
And surely it's no coincidence.
No.
because veterans of the British Army decided to take this number for this brigade.
Well, there are many commonalities, you know as well as I do, between the British Army and the IDF. Mostly going right back to the formation of the IDF, based to a large extent on British Army.
Of course, many people, my own late father included, were served in the British Army. He was towards the end of his service an officer. His commissioning was here in Palestine at a camp which still serves the Israeli Defense Forces. And before you go on into Desert Storm, what is the organizational culture of the British Army? Because many of the Israelis who took part in the formation of the IDF, as you mentioned, along with people who served in Haganah here, or as irregulars, sort of partisan war. But the British veterans brought with them a sort of spit and polish discipline, which was perhaps unnatural to the Sabra spirit.
I mean, it's an interesting comparison. And back then, in the sort of immediate post-war period, that sort of time, the British Army was renowned for its spit and polish. And also for much of my service. I would say today it's probably a bit different. And interestingly, when I was at Sandhurst, our military academy, the army that we studied, I think, more closely than any other army in the world was the IDF. Back then I could name to you pretty much every general in every battle fought in every war that Israel fought.
But mostly the Yom Kippur War and the Six-Day War?
Yeah, mostly, but all of the Israel's wars. And the reason we looked at it so intensely was because, as I mentioned, we were preparing. Our primary objective was preparing to fight the Russians in in Europe, and the only army that was really involved in armored warfare at that time actively was the Israeli Defense Force. And not only that, they were also fighting against Russian equipment. So there were big lessons for us to be learned, and we learned them. I think we learned them pretty effectively, and the I would say to the viewers that I don't think I've met, or if ever, very few British soldiers who don't have the utmost respect for the IDF. If you say what's the best fighting force in the world, many of them will come up with the IDF, and they have huge admiration for the IDF.
But it's mutual. If you ask many Israeli officers, and especially those who are involved in intelligence, they are in awe of MI6 and of military intelligence in the British Armed Forces for the professionalism and ability to be cool and collected, which is not usual for Israelis. So, going back to your Challenger, to the tank, which obviously is part of a series. First, you had the Centurion. It's always starting with a C, and the Challenger. You were in an infantry company accompanying an armored battalion, or a mixed match of.
We did have that. That was the common formation within. We call them battle groups within a brigade. So in 7th Brigade, we had 3 battle groups, which was each battle group made up of a mix of armor, tanks, and armored infantry who moved around in warrior infantry fighting vehicles. Yeah, exactly. As well as other elements like armored artillery and engineers and things. But in fact, that wasn't my role. I was my own regiment did not deploy to the First Gulf War. They stayed in Germany. So I managed to get myself out there as an individual, and I became the operations officer for the commander of 7th Armoured Brigade. So I was in the commander of 7th Armoured Brigade's command tank. I was actually his loader, as well as doing all the stuff that operations officers have to do. And we on that tank, we flew a flag that had been flown by a commander in the 7th Armoured Brigade during the Second World War, the Desert Rats, which was also our nickname, the Desert Rats. So that was my job, was to...
Under Montgomery, 8th Army?
Yeah, back in the day. Because, as we've kind of alluded to, the British Army has... We put a lot of store in traditions, and 7th Armoured Brigade, 7th Armoured Division, Desert Rats, we had the same badge, we wore the same badge in the Gulf War on our shoulders.
Well, the desert again, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
But before the ground phase of the war started, or even before the war itself, in mid-January of 1991, there was this myth, or perhaps propaganda, of the million-man army that Saddam Hussein had, probably many casualties, perhaps chemical warfare. What was it like?
It was in the build-up. We spent several months in Saudi Arabia in the desert, south of Kuwait.
That's the Desert Shield part of.
Yeah, preparing and training and going, doing live firing ranges and things like that. Maneuvers with the Americans. We were, of course, initially my brigade was part of the 1st U.S. Marine Division, and then later we became part of the 3rd U.S. Army for the actual invasion, and. So we spent a lot of time there. And in our preparation, we were. I think people just really didn't know what they were going to be facing. They did know that Saddam had a huge army. We prepared as strongly as we possibly could. And as you know, the Americans and the other allies built massive forces up to overcome this big army
and to protect Saudi Arabia.
Exactly, and so there was a lot of apprehension. I have to say. I didn't feel the Iraqis would put up very strong opposition, and that was based mainly on my study of the IDF and how the IDF had fought different Arab armies and how the Arab armies had operated, and I was, I was right in that assessment, because when we went into Kuwait and into Iraq, we actually invaded directly into Iraq and then swung around into Kuwait. The Iraqi army was pretty much routed. They'd been subjected to a lot of airstrikes and advanced artillery, long-range artillery strikes. And we went in and we completely outmatched them. And we had tanks that could fire out to about 3,000 meters. They had tanks that could fire out to about 1,000 meters. We had great night and day visibility. They had only daytime visibility. So it was in many ways a bit like a turkey shoot. And the Iraqis were surrendering very quickly. There were some pitched battles and there were some hard battles. Some Iraqis fought very hard. But the majority, I think, ended up surrendering very, very quickly.
From your perch as an operations officer, looking up and around, what was it like to fight in an alliance? You were, as you said, subordinate to American command. Eventually, the overall commander was General Schwarzkopf, the CENTCOM commander, of course, who had his orders coming from Washington. There was this Arab alliance, ostensibly led by Prince Khaled of Saudi Arabia, but this was secondary. Did you feel that it was convenient to fight with allies and under foreign command?
Yeah, it worked extremely well. Just to pick you up on one point, the Arab armies, I wouldn't have said were secondary, maybe in terms of the actual fighting, but in terms of maintaining political cohesion across the alliance, I think the Arab armies were essential to that. And indeed, that was one of the reasons why, probably the major reason why it was so important that when Israel sustained Scud attacks during that war, that Israel did not respond, because had they done, that would have fractured the alliance. And certainly I think the Arab armies may not have continued to take part. It would have made it very, very difficult.
It's really astounding that not only Egypt, which already had peace with Israel, but also Syria sent forces into Saudi Arabia against the Iraqis.
Yeah, I worked with the Syrian armored formation during not during the fighting itself, but in the work up to the fighting. But in terms of being in an international coalition, it was extremely beneficial, I think, for everybody concerned. And when we first went out there, we deployed, and the Americans deployed immediately, Marines first, into Kuwait. We deployed very quickly after them, I think, mainly for political solidarity with the Americans. But we weren't really ready for that. The British Army did not have the readiness needed to deploy a large formation at short notice into the desert like the Americans did. And so we depended almost totally on the United States Marine Corps for our survival initially.
You, first of all, send in your troops, and then you link up with the equipment only when it comes over land or by sea. And originally, what you have is a hollow unit.
Yeah, I deployed, one of the first to deploy to Kuwait, into Al Jubail, the port, and we basically stayed there and did, acclimatization, preparation training, waiting, and we flew in, waiting while our tanks and armored vehicles and other logistics support arrived by ship. And as I mentioned, in that early stage, we didn't really even have the logistics to support our own lives. So we were dependent on the US Marine Corps for that.
If we jump into Afghanistan 10 years later or so, was that a similar experience to Kuwait and Iraq?
It was very different. I mean, the war in the first Gulf War, Desert Storm, was a full-blown conventional war. Tanks versus tanks, artillery versus artillery, air versus air, etc. The Afghanistan campaign was effectively a counterinsurgency campaign, low level, fought by conventional forces against terrorist insurgents, whatever you want to call them. So it was completely different. It was far more like Northern Ireland compared to the Gulf War. Although, as I mentioned in the previous part, it's too easy to take a template from Northern Ireland and put it on Afghanistan because they're completely different. But
what was your own mission? Eventually, you commanded all British troops in Afghanistan, didn't you?
Yeah, 2003, I was the commander of British forces in Afghanistan. But that sounds probably grander than it is, because the British forces in Afghanistan at that time, we were based in Kabul and in Mazar Sharif in the north. We were not in Helmand, where later the British Army deployed to. We had a relatively small number of forces. I was a colonel. A colonel doesn't command vast forces. So my command there was not huge. But I had responsibility for all British troops in Afghanistan and British Air Force assets as well. We had a couple of planes. And we worked closely with the NATO command structure there. And my forces, I had forces doing different roles around the country, but the majority of them were working under the Canadians in Kabul, doing counter-terrorist patrol activity in Kabul.
The chain of command led from NATO to the Americans, and then to the Canadian force, and then to your force?
It was a complicated situation. I was the direct commander of British forces there, and my chain of command went straight from me to the UK. That was my boss was in the UK, the Ministry of Defence, or the permanent joint headquarters under the Ministry of Defence. So every decision affecting the UK forces had to be made by me in connection with London. But our forces that were deployed on, for example, operations in Kabul with the Canadians, they would operate under the operational control of the Canadians. So in other words, they would follow the orders of the Canadian chain of command, which went to NATO. It didn't go then to the Americans. There was a separate operation.
But in practice, does it happen that you have two fathers, two superiors? Does it happen that one vetoes the other?
Essentially, Britain could veto any decision made by NATO, the Americans, or anybody else. And we had our rules of engagement, we had our terms of operations there, and we could veto anything. They couldn't veto us. That's the way national chains of command work. And for example, we had with us in Kabul, we had Germans, French, all operating under different rules, different terms, and their own national command would decide what they could and couldn't do. But it sounds convoluted, it sounds difficult, but it didn't, in my experience, didn't actually affect the operations on the ground, which were pretty, okay, they had the problems, but they were pretty seamless.
The Americans stayed on for 20 years there and only left in the summer of 2021 in a shameful manner. And the Taliban came back. Was that preordained?
It wasn't just the Americans; it was the Brits as well. We were there right till the end, and we left also in a shameful manner. And in my opinion, that it was a huge misjudgment to withdraw in the way we did. It wasn't preordained. Yes, of course, every operation ends at some point, but it was premature given the circumstances. And I believe it was a humiliation for the US, the UK, and the other countries involved, and NATO as a whole, which I think probably led directly to the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, who was emboldened by seeing the weakness that NATO exhibited in Afghanistan.
You were also seconded to COBRA. As far as we know, a snake may have some teeth, but and they are sharp and probably dangerous, but they are not very big. Well, what is that cabinet office briefing room A or without the A? What is that COBRA?
COBRA is a glamorous way of saying, as you say, cabinet office briefing room A. COBRA is the UK National Crisis Management Committee, chaired by the Prime Minister, can be chaired by people lower than him, but at the top level it's chaired by the Prime Minister and attended by the Cabinet. And it's kind of equivalent to, let's say, what's more familiar perhaps from Hollywood is, the White House Situation Center, etc. It's that kind of thing. It sounds more glamorous than it is. It's basically the way the UK coordinates and reacts to a crisis or an expected crisis occurring.
And usually you vainly wait for a crisis to happen?
Well, you don't sit around in COBRA waiting for something. COBRA is convened when either intelligence is received that something's going to happen or something does happen. And my role in COBRA was I was working for an organization called the Joint Intelligence Committee at the time, responsible for international terrorism. And my role was chairman of the COBRA Intelligence Group, which basically coordinated all of the national intelligence services, MI5, MI6, GCHQ, police intelligence, military intelligence, to support COBRA when there was a crisis. And it was, in my time, just as an example, we had the 7/7 London bombings, July 2005. We had the 21/7 London bombings a couple of weeks later. We had major terrorist attacks which involved British people in Bali and other places.
And also British terrorists working for Al Qaeda. Or others.
Absolutely. And we had kidnappings which we had to deal with of British citizens in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So there was quite a range of crises we had to deal with during my period there.
Do you see any permanent lesson? Because obviously following 9/11 in the United States, there was the expectation and apprehension that more major acts of terror will follow. And as you mentioned, you had the July 2005 incidents. But generally, more than 2 decades have gone by and no major wave of terror.
Yeah, we've had a lot of low-level terrorist attacks in the UK. And when I say low-level, I include the Manchester Arena bombing a few years back, which killed a large number of people. But it was the low-level in terms of these are not necessarily major organized attacks. They're individuals or small groups operating under the motivation, let's say, of the Islamic State. But one thing I would say is that there have been a number of plots, there have been a number of attempted attacks. There have been far more that have been prevented by our intelligence services than the public will ever know about. So there's still planning. There's still a huge number of people who are suspected of planning terrorist attacks. And one thing I would say is I pay tribute to the role of Israel in this, because Israeli intelligence, not just Britain, but countries around the world, benefit from Israeli intelligence, one of the best intelligence services in the world, which provides, in many cases, including in my personal experiences, provides operational intelligence that directly leads to the prevention of terrorist attacks and therefore saves lives. And I think, Great Britain, the US, Canada, Australia, other countries in Europe, in the Middle East, can be so grateful to Israel for the life-saving intelligence they provided to our countries.
But nevertheless, your Five Eye organization is only Anglo-Saxon. Israel, of course, claims that it is the sixth eye because it begins with an I, but that also applies to Iraq, Iran, Italy, and others.
Well, the Five Eyes, of course, is Australia, Canada, US, UK, New Zealand. And I work very closely within that grouping during my time in the Joint Intelligence Committee and COBRA. But I would say Israel is the sixth eye. It may not be because it begins with I, but I think Israel has privileged intelligence access to all of the countries concerned and to Five Eyes intelligence, and mainly because Israel is such an effective intelligence operative and is so beneficial and valuable to us, but also...
So it's a producer and a consumer.
Yeah, absolutely. The relationship works in both directions. And we, many times we would exchange intelligence with the Israelis, which was beneficial to them. It wasn't just a one-way street.
Two final questions, because our time ran out. When did you decide to retire as a colonel rather than stay on, perhaps made general?
I got to, it was, I think, around 2006, I retired from the army. And I decided to do that mainly because I saw a future of sitting behind a desk. And my life was not to sit behind a desk. I joined the army in order to fight. That was why I joined. That's why most people who volunteer to serve in the British Army, they want to fight. I wanted to fight. And the higher up you get, the less you do, the more you are behind a desk. So that was the main reason I decided to leave.
From your vantage point at COBRA, the interrelationship between the political echelon and the professional military and intelligence level in democracies, is that workable?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's. I mean, one thing I would observe is that from my interactions with, for example, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Defence Minister, and the intelligence services, is that certainly in the UK, that ministers often tend to be almost dazzled by the intelligence services. It's a bit like with special forces; they're dazzled by special forces, probably unjustifiably in many ways. But for that reason, there doesn't tend to be, in my experience, much friction between the two. I think it works quite well, and probably, if anything, cabinet ministers should be more have more of a grip on the intelligence
one
services.
of our former foreign minister, Tzipi Livni, who earlier worked for Mossad, had the same observation that some of her colleagues in the cabinet were dazzled by the pyrotechnics. Now, Colonel Richard Kemp, we regret that you had to fight over this last hour across a desk, but it was our pleasure.
My pleasure too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was the second part of our conversation with retired Colonel Richard Kemp of the British Army. We will be back with another edition of Watchmen Talk. Shalom from Jerusalem.